I'm Steve McDonald. I run the Africa program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. The center, as you know, is the living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, who was our only true academic as a president, having been having a doctorate and a degree, and served as a president of Princeton University, and believed very strongly in the bringing together the world of ideas and the world of policy. And that's what the center is all about, trying to bring together people who think and work in the field and are experts on various policy issues with the policymakers who are taking that information and hopefully making better policy with it. We are very, very happy today to have Dr. Nick Westcott with us, who is the Managing Director for Africa for the European External Action Service. I'm particularly happy myself on this because I've been working on Africa for a very long time myself, and I've always been concerned about the lack of formal and informal coordination of policy between the United States and the European continent. I think that's been to all of our detriment to not have made that connection. Africa has a very, very different experience with the Europeans and the European community as they have with the United States, and there's much we can learn from each other on that. For a while, I actually worked at the Atlantic Council of the United States and tried to more formalize the linkages between Europe and America on Africa. So it gives me great pleasure to have Nick here today. You, I think, have a copy of his bio in front of you, so I won't go through the whole thing. He's been managing director for Africa for EU since February the 1st, just fairly new into the position. His most recent posting prior to that was held the post of the British High Commissioner to Ghana up until earlier this year. He was also at that time accredited to Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Togo, and Niger. And he's just told me now a great anecdote, which I'll pass on to you, that he had the great, probably credential building experience of being asked to leave to Ivory Coast by Gbagbo just before he left his post. So he got PNG'd by Gbagbo and then invited back by Ouattara. But anyway, additionally, he's served as Chief Information Officer of British Foreign Commonwealth Office from 2002 to 2007 and other postings around the continent. We won't go through that. But he's here to talk to us, and as there's our normal protocol here, he'll speak for about 20, 25 minutes or so on Europe and Africa, and then we'll leave it open for questions and answers and a little exchange with all of you and hear your views. So with no further ado, Nick.
Steve, thank you very much. Can you hear me at the back there? Good. I asked that at a conference recently, and a man at the end flung up his hand and said, "I can hear you perfectly, but I'll happily change places with someone who can't." So, anyway, I'm conscious that it's bright and sunny outside. I will keep my remarks brief, but I'm happy to stay as long as you want to carry on asking me questions. My new job is called Managing Director for Africa. And when I told my colleagues in Accra that I was going to be Managing Director for Africa, they said, "Oh, and which company are you going to work for?" I had to admit that this was a new company, a diverse company, a mixture of European civil servants and foreign diplomats being brought together by the High Representative, Cathy Ashton, to effectively become the European diplomatic service, which Europe had not effectively had before. It had never had a foreign office. And since the Lisbon Treaty was introduced, we'd had a foreign policy, we'd had a foreign minister called the High Representative, but it did have effectively no foreign ministry. So she had nothing to support her. From the 1st of January, the External Action Service came into being, and it has steadily been populating its senior functions, and I finished my job in Accra late on the 31st of January, and I started my new job in Brussels early on the 1st of February. So there wasn't a lot of gap between, but the High Representative was very keen that I should start as soon as possible. So I did. And my role as Managing Director is to try and bring together all the diverse threads of Europe's relationship with Africa in a way that we've not been able to before. Up to that point, we had a development partnership through the Cotonou Treaty, through our development cooperation offices, delegations in most African countries. We had a trade relationship run by the DG Trade, who again negotiated in the WTO on the economic partnership agreements, the EPAs, and we had a sort of political relationship that existed from time to time, but these were not brought together into a single coherent policy towards Africa as a whole and African countries bilaterally on an individual basis. Now we can do that. And my responsibility is not just to the High Representative for foreign policy issues, but I have a role across the whole of the European institutions. I brief the European Parliament when required. If President Van Rompuy or President Barroso are visiting African heads of state, I go along and brief them. I work as much with Commissioner Piebalgs, the Development Commissioner, as I do with Cathy Ashton. And although I don't have formal responsibility for the development programs, clearly we need a coherent, knitted together policy and a common strategy and all that. So that is what my role encompasses. A key part of that is our relationship with Africa as a whole. And that's why I entitled this talk Union to Union, How Europe and Africa Are Getting Along. Because it is that relationship between the two unions which makes this different from and complementary to the bilateral relationships that exist between the individual member states of the European Union and the individual member states of the African Union. So a lot of the issues I deal with revolve around relationships with individual states, in which some of the member states have particular interests, but we are trying increasingly to see it through a collective prism, both on the European side and, as I'll explain, on the African side as well. So what I want to say revolves around three core themes: the cooperation between our two unions, the way we work together to find political solutions to the problems that beset some parts of Africa, and thirdly, how we collectively try to press ahead the economic integration, both of our two unions and within that, within Africa itself. The relations between Europe and Africa have a long history, quite a turbulent history in many cases. And the relationship has not been, over many years in the past, one between equals. Increasingly now it is, in fact, and perceived to be, a relationship between equals. And this is a very important evolution of the relationship. There is a huge amount of historical baggage still that impacts on this relationship. And although we are now at a time 50 years after independence, and when you think about it, the height of the colonial period from 1880 to 1960 was really only 80 years. Africa has been independent nearly as long as it was under colonial rule. And before that, there were centuries during which most of Africa was independent, although under the influence, a growing influence in a globalizing world from Western nations and their trade relationship. So this distance from independence is gradually enabling the relationship to be put in a longer-term historical perspective, rather than just overshadowed by the legacy of colonialism. And that's very important, that the European Union is effectively a post-colonial construct itself. Founded in 1957, the evolution of its own history and the fact that of the 27 member states, the vast majority never had any colonies themselves. On the contrary, one of the most interesting things I have found since picking up this job and talking to a number of the new member states in the European Union, Slovenia, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, Poland, they associate with African countries, having themselves gone through a political evolution that has brought them out from a foreign controlling hand. And that is having an impact on the relationship and the equal relationship between the European Union and the African Union. Within the European Union, let me just say a little bit about how things are evolving, because the development of a common foreign policy, which is what we're seeing under the Lisbon Treaty, is relevant to how we are now relating to the African Union. The Maastricht Treaty back in 1992, signed in 91, entered into force in 92, set out for the first time that there should be a common foreign security policy. And since then, it has been evolving actually quite fast. And a security and defense element was introduced under the Nice Treaty. And under the Lisbon Treaty, all this is encapsulated with a high representative with a foreign policy mandate. And we're increasingly looking to present our position in common wherever we can. And that is something that all member states are broadly happy with. It doesn't mean that there are no longer bilateral relations. And in Africa, my personal experience there, those bilateral relations remain very strong. They remain very particular. Sometimes they are quite fraught. But the European relationship is becoming more and more of an umbrella that enables some of those bilateral relationships to be put in a wider context, which is proving broadly to be beneficial. Again, getting away from some of this shadow of the past. It also means that the European Union collectively is beginning to coordinate more effectively with other international actors, both other countries like the United States, who are a major partner for all African countries, and international bodies like the United Nations. And I've become aware over the last year, but particularly the last 2 months, that the European Union is both a multilateral organization, like the UN, and perceived as a bilateral partner, like the US. And it falls somewhere in between the two. But because of its multilateral nature, African countries and other international organizations find it in some ways easier to deal with. It's not exactly the same as the World Bank. It's not exactly the same as the United Nations, but it has affinities. And therefore we can act as a partner with these organizations, particularly with the UN, in a way that individual member states don't. We are evolving as well, with the External Action Service and a clear foreign policy, some more coherent strategic views. Now, there already existed an EU-Africa strategy, the second version of which was agreed at the Tripoli summit. I will not bore you by spelling out all the different areas and all the different policies that's in it. I come, I guess, from a pragmatic diplomatic tradition and sometimes feel there are too many strategies, and what we need to do is get on and do things. But the strategy is nevertheless important for charting a direction in which our relationship should evolve. And for me, the three core elements of the strategy that we as a European Union have for Africa revolves around three things: peace, prosperity, and partnership. And these are fairly self-explanatory. And I will discuss how those three areas are being implemented or put into practice in a moment. Let me come to the African Union side of the relationship. There too, the African Union has been evolving very fast, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years. The shift from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union, long negotiated, big fanfare, but didn't immediately make a huge difference. But I think now, and the same with the European Union, it's taken 30, 40 years to evolve to its current state. The African Union development is beginning to accelerate. As the member states of the AU find the benefits of working together in a set of areas, and as the institutions that have been set up within the AU are beginning to find their feet and find a means of working. A great deal of credit is due to the current African Union Commission, to its chairman, Jean Ping, to its commissioners, who are beginning to put in place mechanisms that work. And secondly, to the founders of the African Union itself, who put in place bodies like the PSC, the Peace and Security Committee, which is a small selection of the member states. So not everything has to be done at 50 in the full plenary and the grand summits, but there is a committee, the PSC, that can meet more often and look at immediate crises. And that is beginning to play a crucial role within Africa and in the relations with the European Union itself. So the African Union is evolving. This evolution on both sides is making a relationship of an equal partnership easier to build. And that is where we are increasingly seeing both the institutional relations, where we have an annual, triennial summit, annual meetings between the 2 colleges, as they're called, the African Union Commission and the European Union Commission Plus, Presidency and High Representative. And they are meeting to talk about things in common. And secondly, regular meetings, particularly on foreign policy issues, between, for example, the EU's PSC, Peace and Security Committee, and the African Union's PSC, who meet twice a year to discuss common issues. So the issues we're dealing with in substance are becoming weightier, and the mechanisms that are created are beginning to work. And I can illustrate this and illustrate my 3 themes, peace, prosperity, and partnership, by looking at 2 sets of current issues. Firstly, the political crises that we've been dealing with collectively over the last year or 2. And secondly, the process of economic integration, which again has been becoming more intense, though it is hard to say that it is showing the same degree of progress. To some extent, it has been a bumpier ride on the economic integration side, and we might discuss after I finish speaking why that is. Current crises. Let me start with the most immediate one, rather than in chronological order. On Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, the European Union worked very hard over the last 5 years to support the negotiating process after the Civil War to lead to a situation where elections could be held that would deliver an accountable government. At first there was an international contact group which didn't really get anywhere. Then there was the Burkinabe-mediated Ouagadougou process, which produced the Ouagadougou Accords, which did make progress, very good progress, and brought together the various bodies. Interestingly, this was not part of the African Union. It was backed by the African Union. Blaise Compaoré was made the coordinator by ECOWAS for its efforts, but it was very largely a locally, regionally managed peace process, and it seemed to be working well. the European Union's role there came in support of the election process, helping fund the preparation of the voters' list, helping support the developing competencies of the Electoral Commission, supporting the United Nations in its role through UNOSI, and working in partnership with the UN and in support of the Ouagadougou process. All this eventually led to the elections that were held October, November last year. And that should have delivered an outcome that was accepted by all the participants. In the event, it did not. And I won't go into too much detail now. You can ask me more about it, but you all know the story. One party did not. In response, ECOWAS took the lead immediately in recognizing Ouattara as the legitimate president, calling upon Gbagbo to step down. That position was strongly supported by the African Union, although a slightly longer process was then needed as to how to reach that end, given the position of one or two member states, particularly Angola and South Africa, in that process. But the African Union remained arbitrator of that process, and ended up with all member states of the African Union supporting the outcome of the election, endorsing Ouattara as the victor, and asking Gbagbo to stand down. The European Union backed up the African position. We introduced a number of measures, including sanctions on individuals and on government entities to try and deny Gbagbo the funds that he was using to prop up his position. But absolutely in support of the position taken by the African Regional Organization and the African Union. They were in the lead in the political response to that. As things have evolved, the situation has got more complicated, more difficult, and it ended last weekend with the UN having to intervene with, at their request, some support from the French forces on the spot, LICOM, to try and prevent further suffering to the civilians by bringing an end to Gbagbo's resistance to the outcome of the election. Not a happy situation that anyone would have wished, but the only way of resolving what had degenerated into a renewed civil war. Again, the European Union at this stage stands ready to provide whatever support it can to enable the rapid reconstruction of Côte d'Ivoire as soon as a legitimate elected government is firmly installed. We're not at the end of that process yet, as you know. Events are still continuing. But the point I want to draw from this is that that was a very good example of the African Union operating in the way it has evolved to take a leading role in trying to resolve Africa's problems, with the European Union playing a supporting role to back up their own position. I'll mention also briefly Libya, which is a more complex situation because Libya is not just a member of the African Union, it's a member of the Arab League, it's a neighbor of the European Union across a very short stretch of water. So there's a more complicated international diplomatic geography involved there, and a rather less clear-cut situation than existed in Côte d'Ivoire, where there was an election which was sufficiently free and fair and did produce a duly elected winner. The position is a lot more complicated. Again, the African Union takes very seriously the need to try and resolve the conflict that exists in Libya, and has been taking time to develop its own roadmap for how we can get there. And we are in the process, through talks taking place even this week and next week, of incorporating the AU into the international effort. And a meeting will be held in Cairo, I believe, next week, sponsored by the United Nations, with the African Union, the European Union, the Arab League all participating. So we're joining up the collective efforts to try and resolve this issue, which is a very complex one as well. Looking backwards a little, on the Sudan, again, the European Union and African Union are working hand in hand to ensure that the evolution of a two-state outcome. Basically, we had a situation where for many years we had one state that was not viable. It was evidently not viable and resulted in a long civil war, and the CPA that brought it to an end included the European Union as one of the observers, one of the sponsors of the CPA process. And the African Union has similarly taken a strong position. It has endorsed the CPA, the referendum, the outcome of the referendum, and the independence of South Sudan, and the EU will come in support of that. We have means that we can deploy through our development partnership to back up and help create a viable state in the south, and we are looking afresh at our relationship with the Khartoum government and the north as to how we can help that become a viable state, because the two must stand or fall together. So on Sudan, again, we have a very rich and detailed dialogue on a very current issue on which we both have a vital interest of the successful outcome, and working hand in hand both on the political and economic side to try and ensure that happens. Looking to the future, there are other areas where we will want to be working the same way. And one that leaps to mind is Somalia, where again you have an intractable dispute, but the European Union and the African Union can both bring to it important ingredients. The EU is already providing a lot of support to both the action of AMISOM, the work of the transitional federal institutions, and providing humanitarian support to alleviate the suffering of the people while the conflict continues. But we want to work with the African Union to achieve that political solution that will enable the conflict to end. And I hope under our strategy we'll be able to build closer cooperation on that in the future to help achieve that end. So those are 4 examples where, under the heading of peace, the AU and the EU can be increasingly effective by working together. I want to look secondly at the economic integration, building prosperity. And here, the arrival of the External Action Service is going to take a little longer, I suspect, to demonstrate its immediate impact, because the existing relationships are really quite deeply embedded. Under first the Lomé Treaty, then the Cotonou Treaty, we have a development partnership with the ACP countries, including the bulk of the sub-Saharan African countries, which is very well established. We are now on the 10th EDF, as it's known, the 10th European Development Fund. And the European Union as a multilateral organization is, I think, the biggest or second biggest after the World Bank donor towards African development. And if combined with the contribution of European Union member states, is way the biggest. And therefore, this partnership is critical. African countries themselves, those I've spoken to, find the development partnership with the European Union quite congenial, because there's a very high degree of dialogue and consultation over what the development funds should be spent on that goes into it. It's institutionalized there. And by and large, this means that they feel, that African countries feel a strong sense of ownership of the development programs that we have. In many countries, the European Union is far and away the biggest donor. And unlike most member states, it has a presence in almost every single country across sub-Saharan Africa. So it's both an intense, a fruitful, and an almost universal partnership that we have with individual African countries. That has enabled us to have a degree of frankness and honesty in our dialogue with some African countries, because there is an institutional framework in which it can be addressed that has been agreed by both sides. And under the Cotonou Treaty, we have two key elements there. The first, under Article 8, is a political dialogue. And the political dialogue has to go alongside the development dialogue in all of these countries. It enables both sides to raise issues that may be of concern to them. And that political dialogue becomes very important in periods of transition. And I was, as you mentioned, simultaneously to being in Accra, our ambassador to Lomé, to Togo, as a British ambassador. In Togo, there are very few member states represented, and the European Union takes the lead, a strong lead in this political dialogue, and it has been very fruitful. And in the lead up to the elections in February 2010, the EU's political dialogue was crucial to driving forward a policy, together with the dialogue that was being promoted by President Blaise Compaoré of Burkina Faso, who was also the ECOWAS facilitator for the political process in Togo, in ensuring that the elections remained open to the opposition, that the opposition was willing to participate because they felt that there would be a reasonable degree of openness and transparency about the vote, and leading to an outcome which, while not 100% satisfactory from everybody's point of view, was sufficiently open, transparent and fair that it carried a legitimacy and an acceptance both for the people of Togo and for the international community. That political dialogue had been a very important element of that. If things are not going well, or in response to a coup, or, as in the case of Niger, an attempt by a president to prolong his stay outside of the constitution, the Cotonou Treaty also provides under Article 96 for a dialogue leading to the suspension of aid, unless remedial action is taken. So we don't just take a unilateral decision and say, right, we're going to stop aid. It's a process that we have to engage with the African partner to explain why, what the problems are, give them an opportunity to put their point of view, make suggestions to how they might remedy the problems of governance or corruption or illegitimate government that are being raised. We recently had an Article 96 dialogue with Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau has not had a coup, but it has severe challenges in its governance that we wanted to raise under Article 96 because we felt it impaired the ability of our development program, our mutually agreed development program, to achieve its objectives. And this revolved around the role of military in politics, the inability of the rule of law to effectively constrain the trafficking of drugs through the country. But Article 96 gave us an ability to challenge the government on these issues and for them to make a response, which we hope, along a benchmarked roadmap, will enable us to resume our support into a context where we'd have greater assurance that our money is going to be put to good use. Where is the African Union in all this? Through NEPAD and other innovations, the African Union too is beginning to engage with the issue of governance, and particularly coups. And we have seen through our joint work in Niger and on Guinea, just to take some West African examples, where again the EU and the African Union work together to achieve a solution to restore democratic government following its interruption by, in Niger's a slightly complicated case. First unilateral action by a president and then a coup to remove him. In Guinea's case, a transition after the death of somebody I might casually call a despot, as long as you don't quote me on that. But a long-term single ruler. So, although the African Union has no structural part in the EU cooperation agreements with African partners, we are very often working along the same lines, in the same direction, using different tools. All that is part of our program to build prosperity, for which an essential ingredient is effective governance. And that prosperity agenda continues. Let me talk about EPAs, because besides development assistance, true growth, real poverty reduction is going to come about through stimulating growth, through developing private sector that is able to create jobs and create wealth. And that is what EPAs, the Economic Partnership Agreements, are designed to achieve. They have, however, become very controversial. Some governments, quite a lot of organizations, lobby groups have argued that they are, in the form proposed, unequal treaties. They were put on the table by the European Union in an effort to create a privileged trading relationship which would support economic growth in African countries, which was compatible with the WTO rules of reciprocity. It therefore provided asymmetric benefits with far greater free access for the African countries while they built up their own capacity, but over time a transitional period enabling the lifting of duties on the African side as well as the European side to meet the WTO criteria. Negotiations have rather run into the sand for two reasons. One, to be honest, the terms of the EPAs do not make that much difference to a number of African countries who benefit in terms of their relationship with Europe from the everything but arms provisions, which is rather similar to AGOA, whereby the least developed countries have duty-free access for more or less everything anyway. And that will happen whether they sign up to an EPA or not. A few of the middle-income countries, it makes a huge difference. But they are a minority. And therefore, because we aimed to use the EPAs, we, the European Union, to foster the process of regional economic integration, which is essential for building a scale of market in Africa that will enable private sector growth, because so many African countries are of a scale, economic scale, that they cannot generate sufficient growth from their own domestic market. When you only have sort of 8 million, 20 million people, that's not an economically viable size of market to generate private sector growth unless you have a wider market to sell into or buy from. We have been negotiating these with the regional economic organizations recognized by the African Union. And this has proved very difficult because those regional economic organizations have different interests within themselves and have found it difficult to develop a negotiating position in some cases and have some significant different interests within. So where this process is going is something that I, along with other colleagues in the Commission, European Commission, those responsible for trade, are beginning to think about. What price pursuing the EPAs as they currently stand, or what alternative could there be that would enable privileged access to the European market for most African countries, helping stimulate their growth, but in a way that's compatible with the WTO. The default is to go back to GSP, those of you who follow trade issues, the General System of Preferences, which would put a number of African middle-income countries at a significant disadvantage by comparison with former arrangements under Cotonou or future potential arrangements as proposed under EPA. So there's a very difficult issue there, which is contentious in Europe's relations with Africa. The AU angle on this is that the AU has high aspirations in the long run for African economic integration. The EPAs were aimed at trying to support that. It appears that they are not an effective, or rather an acceptable tool for doing it. So we wait to see what African regional economic organizations and the African Union itself can do to develop this integration with which we can then partner. So the challenge to some extent then rests back on the African side to demonstrate their commitment to economic integration for their own benefit, to which we are ready to respond as and when. So where next in the relationship? I've indicated some lines along which I think it is evolving, both in cooperation to establish peace and security, cooperation to create greater prosperity. European construction over the years since 1957, when the Treaty of Rome was signed, has been a bit like the labours of Hercules, except there are not just 12. There are 12 every year. African Union construction, as it gets more serious, is finding that there are major labours, major tasks of that kind, which are never easy to resolve. But they are beginning to face up to the fact that sometimes these difficult decisions are necessary. In other words, we are moving from the easy task of setting strategies, visions, treaties, that's the easy bit. But actually, when you come to implement that, it gets tough. And it gets tough within your organization, let alone between that yourself and other organizations. The EU has some experience that it can share with the African Union. And we want the partnership between the two to be supportive in that way, because the more integrated Africa becomes, the easier and more fruitful the relations between our two organizations can become. At which point, I'll end.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. A very wide-ranging opening remark. An awful lot to think about there, an awful lot of meat to digest, and I'm sure get some really good, fruitful questions. I think most of you know the protocol here. We are being webcast live, so unfortunately you're it's all on the record, so, so it's too late to not quote you. So when we recognize you, raise your hand, I'll recognize you. Wait for the microphone to arrive so that others can hear you when you ask your question, and please identify yourself. Thank you very much. I'm ready to take, or we're ready to take questions. Okay, I see one right here. Ali, thank you.
I'm Brian Beery, journalist for Europolitics. I see that you've only recently started in the EAS a couple of months ago, and before that you were in the British Foreign Service. Just wondering what your observations are after a couple of months in the job about the difference in political culture in Brussels, and what your first sort of observations of that are. And then just a more sort of legalistic type question. I'm curious as to, do you retain your status as a British diplomat while you're a European diplomat or not, and will you eventually return to the British Foreign Service?
Be asking what I'm paid next.
Do you have a job?
Do you want me to answer one by one?
I think it's good if you take a note of those to pick up about 3 of them at a time. That's what we normally do. Okay, right at the end there. Stanley?
Stan Schroeder, Chairman of the Board of the Constituency for Africa. Thanks to Steve and Ambassador Robin Sanders here, we had a look at the U.S., Africa, and China relation. Could you give us some insight on the EU and the European look at China and its, I guess I'd say, aggressive investment into Africa?
Very good. Thank you, Stan. And one more, if we have a hand. Okay, there we go.
Hi, thank you so much. I am Maria Posey, working with the UN Information Center, but I'm also here in my capacity as a master's student at Uppsala University in Sweden, which is where I grew up and remember writing this doing this very in-depth study about bananas and banana wars between EU and Africa. And just hearing you today and talking about trade, I'm wondering, is that still the case in these trade arrangements that are being made, where bananas, is a typical example, but I'm sure there are other commodity goods where the European market is still very much protected, and in fact not letting African goods in as much as one might hope? Thank you.
There's a good diverse set to start
Thank
on.
you. I'll answer those in reverse order. And Uppsala, of course, has a fantastic tradition as a centre of African studies. So I think you're very wise to choose that as a place to be based. Although I may now qualify as Europe's Mr. Africa, 10 years ago I was Britain's Mr. Bananas. I spent 3 years here in Washington arguing with the USTR on exactly that issue, and we managed to make a small step forward. And since then, my successors have finally managed to resolve the issue. Trade relations have always been fraught. Anyone who follows trade negotiations knows that these are things, because they involve real cash, real trade, real revenue, and real companies, all of whom have positions. Trade negotiations take forever. We see that in the Doha Development Round, which we are still trying to conclude. I was also here for the battle in Seattle, which failed to launch a round, and the subsequent Doha meeting, which did launch the next round. I'm not holding my breath till the Doha round is concluded. It should be. So these kind of trading issues are very real. Governments feel very strongly about them. But ultimately, the economics drive the fact that reaching a solution is going, in the long run, to be better than not reaching a solution. And that has always, in the past, led us eventually to agree to resolve trade disputes, like bananas, like steel, and to conclude trade rounds. You can apply the same to the EPAs and the trade relations there. We have to find a solution to this, because ultimately not to find a solution would be a major drawback for some really significant African countries, for Ghana, for Kenya, for South Africa. So we've got to find a solution to it. We haven't found the magic formula yet. And because these are always politically contentious issues, for the Caribbean countries, bananas were economic life or death. For one or two American companies, it was similarly a matter of life and death. So the economic interests are engaged on both sides. Politicians and diplomats have to try and broker those, ensure that the long-term benefits are explained clearly. And here we have been failing, I think, on the EPAs, just to explain what the economics underpinning this is, as well as the legality and the negotiating context. And make sure that debate takes place in the public domain, so we've got an informed public. A huge amount of misinformation is thrown about in public on what the EPAs would and wouldn't do, and they have had a direct impact on governments' negotiating positions. Attempts have been made to put additional information to the public domain, but unless you do it effectively, it doesn't get heard. So we have a lot of preconceived notions, a lot of misinformation about, and we've got to cut through that if we're to reach a politically acceptable settlement that people can sell to their constituents, sell to their publics, which we recognize they've got to do. So there's a lot to do, and trade negotiations get very nitty-gritty. The devil is in the detail of exactly what the tariff rates are, exactly what transitional periods are, exactly what rules of origin are, and all that has a very real impact. And although it's very technical, you nevertheless have to try and make sure the public understand enough, because the public take a very strong position on what it is. That's what I'll say about bananas. EU-China and China and Africa. It's very interesting, because I think things are changing even over the last year, I have felt. That there was all much waving of arms around and not alarm, but, you know, just note that China was suddenly taking great interest in Africa. Chinese companies were everywhere. They were moving in. They were taking over natural resource production. And there is some truth in that. Chinese companies were behaving as international, multinational companies normally behave. It's just the fact that they were Chinese. There was a degree of, because a lot of these Chinese multinationals also have a degree of state ownership, there was a presumption that this was a state-directed policy, on which there might be some truth and some elements of it, but also they were looking for commercial advantage in the same way Western multinationals are. And I think, to some extent, the alarm is settling down into a fact that this is an economic relationship in the same way as any other economic relationship exists. And you can see a range of responses, and also a range of responses in African countries to how attractive these deals really are. People are looking in quite a lot of detail at the small print, the fine print of what's on offer, and they will make a commercial judgment of what's beneficial for their own economies, which is fine. And Western companies, if they want to compete, are going to have to compete. So I think there's probably less to this than sometimes meets the eye of the beholder. Nevertheless, it's, from my point of view, very important that China is engaging with Africa. China is a major world power. It is not surprising that they wish to have relations throughout the world. It's not surprising that they wish to have commercially beneficial relations. And the one factor I think that we need to be conscious of is that those recipients of Chinese largesse or Chinese commercial offers do look at the fine print and do make sure that this relationship is one that's going to benefit the African countries concerned. While I was in Ghana, we had traditionally a sort of meeting of heads of mission of the main development partners, and we would involve the World Bank and the IMF. And towards the end of my time there, we would regularly invite the Indian, the Chinese, the Brazilian to come and participate in these meetings. Increasingly, they chose to do so. They chose to do so because they were as interested as we were in the macroeconomic environment in Ghana as a place to come and invest, a place to deliver your aid. Was it going to be well used? Was the CD going to remain a stable currency? That was their interest, so they participated. And they participated in the consultative group dialogue that we had with the Ghanaian government as well. And Chinese were interested because they had an increasing investment in this country, in Ghana. So interests are actually, in some ways, getting closer together. And we can collaborate as well as compete in that kind of market. So I'm an optimist that this is inevitable, and China is finding that its relations with Africa are in fact not that dissimilar to that of other Western countries who have multinationals that want to invest and want to develop a partnership, an economic partnership with African countries. Third point. Yeah. A more personal question. It has been very interesting moving from being a bilateral diplomat to a multilateral. I had worked in Brussels before, so the EU was not a strange animal to me. And in Post Overseas, we worked very closely with the European Commission delegate as well as with other bilateral. What has struck me moving to the EAS is that the work the European Union External Action Service does is diplomatic work. And to that extent, it is exactly the same in nature as what I was doing as a bilateral diplomat, but on behalf of a collective, a collection of 27 member states. But that means it's slightly more complicated because instead of getting your instructions from one capital, you have a negotiation about what your instructions should be between 27 capitals before you then go and deliver it, which makes for more fun and rather longer time evolving. But essentially it's the same. What is Europe's collective interest in our relations with Ghana or Nigeria or Ethiopia, whatever? And what is our collective interest in helping stabilize the situation in Somalia, achieve peace? Much the same. So the work is, in many ways, exactly the same. It's the kind of work I was doing before. Second thing that struck me is that the EU, however, does not yet have the processes to ensure it can operate so effectively as a diplomatic actor. And that's partly because across Africa, European delegations were fundamentally development assistance oriented. There were delegations there operating in the way development agencies did, rather than as political. They've now taken on, under the Lisbon Treaty, lead role managing the political relations between the EU and this country. There are still the bilateral relations that go alongside, of course. So EU delegations and the EAS as the sort of headquarters responsible, the foreign ministry, if you like, for the EU, have to develop the processes to enable us to respond like that to crises, coups, popular uprisings, you name it. The AU's been finding the same. Very interesting. I was talking to Mr. Lamamra, the Commissioner for Peace and Security in the AU, and looking across events in North Africa, they said it's been very interesting. We knew coups happened, and we had a policy for coups. We knew how to respond. We knew what happened if there was sort of another illegitimate kind of takeover of government. We didn't have an approach. What do you do when there's a popular uprising? That's a new one. We, the AU, didn't have a right. When there's a popular uprising, this is how you respond. They were having to evolve what is our political response to these kind of situations where governments are faced with a popular uprising. So the EU is the same. We're evolving the processes to be able to respond swiftly to changing circumstances like that.
So, not going to tell us if you're getting paid or not, huh? Okay, Ali, I think the first question here with okay, and then here, secondly. That's quite fine.
Hi, I'm a research assistant in Woodrow Wilson Center and personally have been focusing on China in Africa issue. So I would say I really appreciate your opinion, which seems more balanced and objective to me compared to the mainstream, thought in America towards China in Africa. And I also glad to hear the progress that more international powers like India and China are involving into the conference that I held in Ghana. But I have a question that is about, for example, during the past years, we have never heard any big summit or high-level conference held by EU, China, America, and Africa, together to talk about the development issue or what is the best strategy of Africa's development. So if so, what would you say the biggest obstacle for this type of a big event or big summit to happening? And would you expect this type of conference or high-level communication is going to happen in the future? If so, what would you make effort to this type of conference? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, here.
Thanks. Ludger Kühnert. I'm a public policy scholar here visiting from Germany. And I'm working on the interplay of African Union, EU, US, Chinese, Indian strategies. I don't want to bore you with some of my findings, but I think some of the strategic approaches are fundamentally different also between the EU and the US. And I'm wondering without going into detail, and you have to wait for the book to be published, where do you see, either on principle, on more strategic issues, or in a very pragmatic way in terms of practical approaches, more room for cooperation between the EU and the US on African issues? And one second question, I think one of the big differences between the whole way of how Africa and policies are organized in this country and in Europe are the differences in the way the constituencies are formed, how African policies are reconnected to the public discourses in both our societies here and in Europe. And I wonder, what are your initial thoughts on how to strengthen this, all these different policies you have described with the overall public political discourses in Europe? It seems to me that the need to overhaul EPA is also about this. The EU, if I may add this comment, has to reach out beyond the usual community of development aid activists and African specialists and so on. This is exactly what happens here in this society, as far as I'm seeing it. And there is a big gap for us in Europe to reconnect all these new African approaches with the overall, much more broader public discourses in Europe, from health. This is how the AIDS issue has become such a prominent issue here in the US on the African side, to strategic security issues, all emanating in the national political discourse. And that is not the case in Europe. What are your initial thoughts on how to improve this? If EPA and these kind of programs stay so technocratic, technical, there's hardly any way to move beyond the crowd of the very committed and often also critical handful of people interested in these issues. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm Todd Gross. I was with the Voice of America. I was struck by your response on the question of general Chinese economic policies in Africa, especially given that yesterday in this building, Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Johnny Carson, had a far different take on that. And he really was not shy about sharing that opinion that he expressed. And China is far more exploitive and really not, what they're doing in there is not, they're not following the same kind of practices that Western multinationals and corporations are. And he said basically because they're not a democracy. And so they really don't they're not focusing on human rights, on workers, conditions for workers, and this kind of thing. They were far more exploitive. And he was pretty adamant about that. He was not positive at all about the role China is playing in Africa, especially given their economic policies.
Okay. We stayed a lot in the China realm there, but that gives you a lot to
Yes. Let me cover the China issues. They're both very good questions. On big international conferences on development, to some extent, we don't need to. In a week or two's time, you have the spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank, where the EU, the US, China, India, they're all there. And they talk about development, not just in Africa, but across the world. And because I'm a great believer in not multiplying strategies or multiplying forums and meetings for the sake of meetings. If you've got something that can fulfill the purpose, use it. So if China and India and Brazil want to play a larger role in the public discourse and the negotiations that we have twice a year, the spring meetings and the autumn meetings of the IMF and World Bank, which go a bit beyond just what the IMF and the World Bank are spending their money on. They are broader debates, or they provide the context for broader debates about what we're trying to do in development, how we're trying to manage global economic relations, rebalancing. It covers the spectrum, not just the development aspect, but it puts the developed world relations in the context of the global economy. That's what we need to do. You could take some of those participants out and have a separate conference just on the development of Africa, but I don't think that's necessarily as productive. So that would be my answer. Let's use what we've already got. On our relations, or rather our perspectives, there's probably not as much daylight as you might think between Johnny Carson and me. It's just I express it differently. When I say they need to read the fine print, I mean they need to be ensured that the economic relations into which they are entering are not exploitative. No, I can say a bit more. And, you know, there are two things here. One, China is often accused of being politically blind and entirely happy to go and invest in countries where the human rights situation or the political situation is not one that we would support putting our public money or even sometimes private investment into. That too is evolving. I was very interested in 2009 at the Chinese National Day to listen to the then Chinese ambassador to Ghana praising the peaceful and transparent conduct of the Ghanaian elections, which has resulted in a democratic outcome. They too have an interest in political stability. And I think it is increasingly apparent that unaccountable government is politically unstable.
Well, then I'm sorry, I don't know if it follows, but how do you explain Mr. Carson's take on this? Because he was widely divergent from what you had expressed, and hadn't so. So you said it's a matter of degrees, and you're not.
Sorry, we can't conduct an interview here.
Okay.
You may try that afterwards.
Okay, sorry.
And public discourse, or EU-US cooperation. As I've just indicated, we have a very close dialogue, or very intense dialogue with the US, between the EU and the US. To some extent, that is intensified because now there is somebody to talk to, there's a person to talk to on the EU side. Previously, the US had to talk to 8, 10, 27 different Africa directors. I don't replace that dialogue. It's still very important to maintain dialogue with key partners on Africa. But hitherto hadn't been a single person within the EU they've come to say, okay, what's the EU take on this? It's the old kissing of, what's the phone number? The phone number is now mine when it comes to African stuff. And I can't speak for all the individual member states, but I can say, well, on this, I know the member states are of one mind. On that over there might be a range of different policies. But where there is a common view, I can express it, and I can talk to Johnny Carson about it. This is increasingly constructive in a range of areas. For example, our cooperation on the Côte d'Ivoire crisis. We have kept in very close day-to-day relations and made sure that the approach the EU is taking is consistent with what the US are doing, how we are working together in the international organizations to plan the response. It is true on Sudan. Again, the whole international community is collaborating very closely, the EU with the World Bank, the UN, the US, to ensure that we are providing compatible support, and that we're not all rushing in to support the security sector and everybody's ignoring agriculture. We're making sure we've got a package that will support the whole process, and we're taking the lead in different areas. And on Somali piracy, again, it's an international collaboration. Interestingly, it's an international collaboration in which the EU funds Atalanta, the US is present, Russia and China. And the naval force that is helping bear down on piracy in the Indian Ocean is one of the best examples of a common problem in which all international partners who have an interest in ensuring law of the sea and the abolition of piracy are working together. We all have an interest in allowing trade to flow freely through those oceans, those seas. And where there's a common interest, we'll work together in whatever way. We have an awful lot of common interests with the US. Reflecting that in the public discourse is very interesting, because you're right, there is quite a different public discourse about Africa here in the US to the one in Europe. And that's for a whole range of historical reasons. here the issue of AIDS, the issue of terrorism, the issue of the third one, where the US is particularly focused. In Europe, we have a very powerful NGO lobby, charity organizations, development aid organizations, whose voice on Africa is loud, clear, and frequent. Some are advocacy groups, some are charities, but they all speak loud and clear and play a very important part in public discourse. Oxfam, Save the Children, Greenpeace, there's a whole range with particular sectoral interests or general interests in the development. And they tend to play a key part in the public discourse. And governments in Europe respond to that discourse in the approach they take, and that impacts on what the European Union talks about. The development discourse is one that is both academic and public. And it's one in which I would like the EU to play a more active part as a collective. And it's something that I intend to talk about in the months to come with the Trade Commissioner, the Development Commissioner, so that we're in a position to present a coherent view of the EU's overall relations. But I think there's a lot of work to be done there, both to understand what the public discourse is and then to engage with it.
Okay, thank you. We have time for, I think, one more round of questions, if there are some offered right here. The young lady comes.
Thank you. My name is Judith Forat. I'm currently a fellow at the US Institute of Peace. I was at first puzzled by the way democracy came into the picture. At first I was a bit surprised that it was not part of the 3 points, but then you made the link by saying effective governance is important to actually have prosperity. But I was wondering, you talked about dialogue processes, cooperation, union-to-union cooperation. What about conditionality that, has been a common mean to, also put pressure on specific countries? I also ask this question because some European heads of state have proposed, in the light of the recent revolutions and uprisings in North Africa and the Middle East, that we have to rethink our stance towards authoritarian regimes. So I was wondering what the position and strategies in this case.
Thank you. Okay, right over here.
My name is Lambert. I'm with CNS News. I'm just wondering if, given the recent events in Africa, one is left with the impression that Africans on their own will not be able to achieve any peace or anything. We always need to turn to European Union, the United Nations and all that. Do you think that if the EU did not do anything in Africa over the next 10 years, Africa will just be one hell of, call it, problems all over the place? And don't you think that because you keep pumping money to these regimes in Africa, you also help in some way to promote the conflicts that are going on there? Thank you.
Interesting. Okay, and yeah, right. I tell you what, let's go ahead and take both of these questions, and that will be our end questions. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Alain Ikombo, and I'm with Orange Symphony. However imperfect, the influx of Chinese investment into Africa has created what is increasingly perceived as a more economic, more rather competitive landscape. And in a time when there seems to be increasing skepticism about aid and its effectiveness, I'd like to know if you think that this Chinese presence is perhaps changing the paradigm whereby the EU is shifting, starting to look at Africa more as a legitimate trade partner rather than a perennial recipient of Western aid.
Thank you. And hand it right to the gentleman next to you. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Grafe. I'm retired, but admit to have being on the U.S. delegation to the Tokyo and Uruguay rounds of trade negotiations. And I want to thank you for being candid on EPA. It's some candor that I think has been needed for some time. You didn't say anything about Zimbabwe, and I know that SADC is taking some interest in it, and I wondered whether the EU is as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Those will end our questions. Nick, you get the last.
Yeah. In relation to Albert's question, I remember some years ago having a conversation with the central bank governor of Tanzania. This was back in the 1990s. And he said, I am trying very hard to run a rational monetary policy, and I can't, because you guys keep on pumping in huge sums of money and make it impossible for me to impose any effective economic discipline which would help the economy grow. So please stop. And then I can run a rational economic policy. The pumping money in has two problems. The one the central bank governor identified. The second, that money is seen, government money is seen as a free good. If you look at the evolution of democratic institutions elsewhere, it tends to revolve around the issue of taxation and representation, something that resonates here, I seem to remember.
Yes, it does. Particularly in this town. Yes.
In this town. And that, if you look at it, is where an awful lot of accountable political structures came from, because kings or governments had to raise money from the people that they governed in order to provide for security, provide the structures of law, provide for wars if they wanted to fight wars, you know. But they had to raise the money from somebody, and therefore they had to give something back. And that fundamentally underpinned the development of accountable institutions and accountable government. Where your government resources come either fundamentally from extractive industries, which are run by largely foreign companies, or it comes from development aid, that impetus is lacking. It doesn't mean it shouldn't exist, because the government is getting all this money. You'd think people would care how they spend it. But it has led to a sort of more a kind of patron-client structure, or it supports a kind of patron-client structure where the government has this big pot of money. You want to get as much of it as you can. So there is a degree of accountability in that way, but it's a different impetus. So you put your finger on an absolutely critical issue. Now, we could, like Dambisa Moyo, say, take all the money away, stop giving it, and then you'll get both rational economic policies, and people will have to attract outside investment, and you'll get a much more rational system. Nobody's quite tried that yet, and maybe someday somebody will. But that again is affecting the public discourse, and there are questions, increasing questions raised in some quarters as to whether aid is actually a good thing delivering results. Insofar as the European Union has committed itself to provide development support through the Cotonou treaties, we should do that. It's our political engagement, it's part of our partnership with the countries, but we need to make sure it is effectively spent. And this is where democracy comes in, as I mentioned. I haven't used the word, deliberately, conditionality. What matters to me is that the governments to whom development assistance is provided are accountable for the way that money is spent, to their own people. We have spent quite a lot of my money, time, effort to build up the financial accountability in African countries through their own parliaments, through their public accounts committees, through their auditors, all these dull, boring things that actually mean the people of that country have some way of holding their government to account for how the money is spent. That's the ideal conditionality. It's not, I require you to do this because I'm giving you the money. but you owe it to your people to use this money well. That's what we're giving it. We're giving it to you for your people, not for you. So yes, there are elements of conditionality there. It's partly how I express it. No doubt Johnny Carson would put it differently. I don't like authoritarian regimes. They spend money badly. And therefore, the more democratic the regime, the more willing I will be to give it money. That's what Article 96 of the Cotonou Treaty is all about. Why we had this dialogue with Guinea-Bissau last week, saying, how can you guarantee to us this money is going to go to benefit the people, not the armed forces or narco-traffickers or whatever? Is Chinese pressure, Chinese presence, changing the paradigm? There's been a lot of talk about the Chinese paradigm of development, you know, influencing African countries because you can see you can manage, you don't have to have democracy, you can manage growth. It depends what your long-run view is of the prospects of the Chinese paradigm. Mine may be different from that of others. Until you have accountable government, I seriously wonder how certain you can be of future stability. However, in economic terms, yes, the fact that there are potentially huge sums of money available in credit from China. While I was in Ghana, these examples are close to what I've just been doing. At one stage, there were rumors of a $10 billion Chinese credit facility. That was 50% of the country's GDP, and a GDP of 20 billion. And the rumors were that there was a 10 billion credit facility from China. But when you dug down into it, that wasn't actually the case at all. So, you know, don't believe everything you read in the papers about it. Do read the fine print. And ultimately, where Chinese oil companies are coming in, they're competing against Western oil companies. And, you know, it doesn't change the paradigm. Where they're willing to invest in countries that other countries are not willing to invest in. And I didn't mention Zimbabwe. I will mention Zimbabwe now. Marangi Diamonds. There, yes, you could say that whereas the rest of the international community is trying to encourage good governance, there is a degree of, if you like, political blindness on the part of some investors who happen to be Chinese that doesn't reinforce that otherwise international pressure. What about the African Union? In this context, I think the African Union is finding that it has to think increasingly hard. And the response to the Côte d'Ivoire crisis has been different from the response to the Kenyan crisis or the Zimbabwe crisis. We'll see what happens in the future.
Okay, join me in thanking Dr. Westcott. Very, very enlightening presentation.